28. Brian Koberger was talking. In the first hours after his arrest, the suspect was not only willing to discuss the case, but seemed quite pleased to do so. Of course, Koberger said. He knew about the 4 murders in Idaho. Everyone in the area did. After all, he offered with a disarming openness, he lived only about 10 miles from the murder house. He kept on talking, genial and cooperative, denying any involvement in the events, for nearly a quarter of an hour. But as the interrogator's questions grew more pointed, Koberger grew terse. Finally, he said enough. He wanted a lawyer, only he couldn't afford to pay for one. At about 9:30 on the morning of December 30th, a call went out to the office of Jason Labar, the county's chief public defender. In his decades of practice, Labar had appeared before the courts in more than 20 capital cases. He was also a local guy. His family's deep roots in the area reached far back to colonial times. And in his days at nearby Bangor Area High School, he had been a 3-letter man, and 30 years later had been recently elected to the school's Athletic Hall of Fame. He still looked like the rock-solid, broad-shouldered, crew-cutted halfback you'd want to hand the ball when the game was on the line. He could handle the pressures that had come with this sort of case, the authorities decided. Still, when Labar's secretary called to let him know that he would be representing the man accused of killing the 4 Idaho students, he hung up without a word. He was in his daughter's orthodontist's office in New Jersey, and he was in no mood for any jokes. The thought of what the teenager's braces were costing had soured his disposition. After all their years together, though, his secretary knew her boss well enough not to be intimidated. When she called back to insist that she had not been playing around, Labar felt he'd say, as stunned as if a door had slammed in my face. Like everyone else, he'd been following the events in Idaho, but he never could have imagined the trail would lead across the country to his own backyard. When his daughter's appointment was over, he told her he wouldn't be able to take her to the mall to check out the post-Christmas sales. The most famous case in the country, he explained, has fallen into my lap. Friday had been a half day at the public defender's office, and when he arrived, he had the place to himself. He was thankful for the quiet because he needed to concentrate. He'd be representing Koberger in the hearing for his extradition to Idaho, and it was necessary to get a working knowledge of the state's statutes. If his client wanted to fight being sent back across the country to stand trial, Labar wanted to have a viable battle plan. He pored over the Idaho canons, and then hurried to the office's law library to research cases where writs of habeas corpus had been filed to protect the accused from being transported to other jurisdictions. He was feverishly taking notes on a yellow pad when another realization intruded. Every New Year's Eve, he'd meet with a bunch of his old high school football teammates and their wives. They'd sit around in front of a blazing fire talking about the outcomes of games they'd competed in a lifetime ago, play Monopoly, and drink Jägermeister shots while they waited for the Times Square ball to drop. He called his wife and asked her to let the other couples know that they wouldn't be making it this year. He had work to do. Then he returned to the case books and waited for it to get dark. He knew that once the word got out that he was representing Koberger, the press would be monitoring his every move. His plan was to sneak off to the jail. The Monroe County Jail was just a short drive from Main Street, but still it was out in the country and away from any homes. The roads were unlit, and for the entire journey, Labar kept checking his rearview mirror to see if any headlights were on his tail. It remained pitch black the entire way. His strategy had worked. He had not been followed. The prison grounds were surrounded by a high chain-link fence that had curls of razor wire at the top. Labar, who knew his way around the jail, parked on the far side of the compound across from the chain-link door that served as the visitor's entrance. The guard let him in without challenge. He had been expected. Feeling the cold, he walked down a gravel path harshly illuminated by an overhead spotlight for a couple of minutes to a steel-plated door. He buzzed, and the door immediately opened. Here, too, it was as if the guard had been waiting for his arrival. Moments later, a little after 5 p.m., Labar was seated in a windowless interrogation room. The room was as brightly lit as an operating theater. Brian Koberger was let in and took a seat directly opposite him. Labar silently took a quick measure of the accused killer, and his first reaction was surprise. He was not sure what he had expected, but he was nevertheless unprepared for what he saw. Koberger looked, he'd say, normal. He had the sort of open, intelligent face and unblinking eyes that might have easily belonged to one of the young assistant district attorneys that Labar went up against on an almost daily basis in the courtroom. For someone who had been charged with 4 murders, Koberger seemed remarkably calm. Labar felt none of the trepidation, the defensiveness, or, for that matter, the anger that usually enveloped his clients when he sat across from them in the county jail. Koberger's gaze continued to hold steady on him, and to the lawyer's reading, it felt disapproving, as if this were all a mistake that would soon be rectified. Labar began with a warning. He made it clear to Koberger that he would be representing him only in the extradition hearing. Therefore, he did not want to hear any specific details about the case. With that out of the way, the lawyer asked if his new client wanted to release a statement to the press. The arrest was national news, and his guilt was being treated as a foregone conclusion. Koberger, he suggested, might feel it was necessary to respond. Koberger agreed without hesitation, his voice firm. He wanted people to know that he was eager to be exonerated, and he wanted his lawyer to understand that this is not who I am. Labar listened with a studious attention. He was struck, he'd say, by how calm and intelligent Koberger appeared. Murder, the lawyer instinctively felt, seemed a little out of character for the man to whom he was talking. Koberger had the last word. As Labar was packing his yellow pad back into his briefcase, preparing to leave, Koberger said it was important that he make one thing clear. He had not killed anyone. All he knew about the crime, about any of the victims, was what he had read in the newspapers. In Pullman, Washington, meanwhile, at 7:15 on the morning after Koberger's arrest, a team of police officers stood on the landing outside the suspect's apartment. An officer's fist hammered on the door. "Police department! Search warrant! Come to the door!" There was no response, and so he turned a key in the lock. He opened the door but did not enter. Standing on the threshold with his service Glock drawn and extended as if ready to fire, he barked, "Show yourself!" No one came forward, but this was no surprise. The officers knew the tenant was in a jail cell on the other side of the country. Still, they had no solid notion at this point of whether Koberger had any accomplices. It was better to be safe than sorry. The forensic team put on protective gloves and booties and swarmed in. In the bedroom, the officers found a computer tower and an Amazon Fire TV stick, and they carted them off for further examination. At the same time, the forensic team proceeded with a disciplined attention, searching the little apartment for bloodstains, skin cells, and animal hair that had come from the house on King Road. But the officers did not find a knife, or dark-colored clothing, or a mask. There wasn't even a shower curtain that could be examined for any trace evidence that might have been splattered when a killer had been frantically attempting to wash away any clues. The trash can was empty too. Nothing was discovered that immediately confirmed the right man had been arrested. At 1 p.m. the same day, in the wood-paneled city council chambers in the Moscow City Hall on 3rd Street, Chief Fry held a hastily arranged press conference. For 6 weeks, he had endured sharp criticism as the investigation had dragged on without resolution. The constant reminder that the murders had occurred in his town and on his watch. The solemn promises he had made to the victims' parents, which he had begun to wonder if he could fulfill. And now he had accomplished all he had set out to do. He stood at the podium and took a deep breath before he began, trying to rein in his emotions. "Last night," he said, and his voice immediately wavered. He paused, then. "In conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, detectives arrested 28-year-old Brian Christopher Koberger in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania." The words trailed off. His eyes welled with tears, and he blinked them away. Then he found the resolve to continue. "On a warrant for the murders of Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee." That night in Albrightsville, the Kobergers received a call that took them by surprise. It was from one of their son's former professors, Dr. Catherine Ramsland. The name struck a chord. Marianne Koberger had heard her son talking with respect and enthusiasm about the DeSales University professor, a celebrated authority on serial killers. After the arrest, a lot of people had been telephoning, especially the press, and she had scrupulously refused to talk. It was all too painful. But she wanted to hear what Dr. Ramsland had to say. Later, the professor would adamantly refuse to comment on any aspect of the case, including any discussions she may or may not have had with the Kobergers. But according to the version of the conversation the Kobergers had confided to a friend, Dr. Ramsland offered her help. She felt unable to make, the professor reportedly began, any judgment about Brian's guilt or innocence. However, if the family needed any advice as the case proceeded, she would be glad to share her expertise. Brian, she went on, had been one of her most promising students. The Kobergers were seduced. This was the single small kindness that had come their way since all the wretchedness had begun, and the timing was propitious. From the moment the SWAT team had charged into their home in the still of the night, guns leveled, smashing glass and pounding through doors, their lives had turned into something that did not seem possible. The sense of disconnection to any previous reality had been overpowering. At this low moment, they were eager for knowledgeable counsel and a friend. They wanted to trust someone. The discussion quickly turned to their son's extradition hearing. Did the professor think Brian should contest Idaho's attempt to have him return for trial? They had been urging Brian to oppose the writ. They wanted him close to home for as long as possible. But Brian disagreed. He was determined to prove his innocence, and the sooner that happened, then the sooner this entire nightmare would be over. "What do you think, Dr. Ramsland?" the Kobergers asked. The professor agreed with Brian. If he was intent on establishing his innocence, then there was no point in putting off that fight. Anyway, she predicted confidently, Idaho would eventually succeed. A legal skirmish would just be postponing the inevitable extradition. That night, the Kobergers spoke with their son on the phone and conveyed Dr. Ramsland's thoughts. Brian, his mother told an acquaintance, had seemed very excited that his old professor had reached out to his family. On January 3rd, sheriff's deputies led Koberger into the Monroe County Courthouse for the extradition hearing. A deputy kept firm hold on each of his arms, and he was shackled and handcuffed. He wore a red prison jumpsuit. His parents and two sisters were seated in the visitors' gallery, and as Koberger shuffled to his seat next to Labar, he turned toward them. "I love you," he mouthed silently. Moments later, Labar announced that his client would not fight extradition. Afterward, Labar released a statement from Koberger's family. "First and foremost, we care deeply for the 4 families who have lost their precious children," it read. Yet they also wanted it known that they were supportive of their son. "We have fully cooperated with law enforcement agencies in an attempt to seek the truth and promote his presumption of innocence rather than judge unknown facts and make erroneous assumptions." Labar made his feelings clear, too. In a public statement, he sternly lectured, "Mr. Koberger has been accused of very serious crimes, but the American justice system cloaks him in a veil of innocence. He should be presumed innocent until proven otherwise, not tried in the court of public opinion." A day later, a sliver of a moon hanging low in the frigid pre-dawn sky, Koberger, shackled and still in a red prison jumpsuit, left the prison for the drive to an airport outside Philadelphia. From there, he was flown in a tiny fixed-wing Pilatus across country. The plane, after a stop for refueling, landed at Pullman-Moscow Regional Airport, the same airstrip where only about 3 weeks earlier, Michael Koberger had arrived in anticipation of a road trip with his son. Michael, for his part, had spent a large part of that day cleaning up the wreckage that had resulted when the police had stormed into his home. He found cardboard to cover the holes in the broken windows and then affixed strips of duct tape to hold the pieces in place. When he was satisfied, he brought out a shop vacuum to collect the shards of glass that littered the frozen lawn. It was all he could do, he might very well have felt, to repair the destruction that had been caused by his useless loyalty and love.